Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're peeling back the layers on arguably the most intense intellectual rivalry in all of ancient Western philosophy. The legendary, centuries-long feud between the Stoics and the Academic Skeptics.
That's right, a real clash of titans.
And most of us think we kind of know the core of the fight. It was basically about whether knowledge exists at all, right? Can we actually know anything for sure?
That is certainly the common narrative. It's the textbook version, you could say. But when you move past those broad labels and really zoom in, really drill down into the specific Greek terminology they were throwing at each other.
Oh, okay. The actual word.
Exactly. The entire argument starts to reconfigure itself. What we find is actually pretty strong evidence that these two schools, despite being philosophical neighbors, literally living and teaching side by side in Athens for a while.
Yeah.
They might have spent decades, maybe longer, arguing entirely past each other, just completely misunderstanding the very definitions of their own core practices.
Wow. Okay. So not just disagreeing, but fundamentally misunderstanding what the other side was even doing.
Precisely. It's like they were speaking slightly different dialects of the same philosophical language.
So today, we are going to explore a linguistic tripwire, a specific distinction that, once you see it, fundamentally recontextualizes this whole ancient battle. Our mission today is to dive deep into the nuanced difference between two concepts, concepts often carelessly translated as basically the same thing. Asunkatathesis, which we'll explain as the local act of withholding assent.
Right, on a case-by-case basis.
And Epochē, which is more like a global posture, a general suspension of judgment about everything.
We'll argue, based on the evidence we have, that the early Stoics, we're talking the founders here, like Zeno, Cleanthes, and especially Chrysippus, maintained a really strict intentional boundary between these two terms.
Okay.
They saw Asunkatathesis, this withholding of assent, as their own rigorous, surgical, rational practice. It was key to their path to wisdom.
Their tool.
Exactly. And they saw Epochē, the suspension of judgment, as the defining doctrine, but also the fundamentally flawed doctrine of their academic opponents.
So understanding this separation, this boundary they drew, is really the key to understanding how a wise person, the Stoic sage, was actually supposed to handle uncertainty in their own mind, impression by impression.
That's the core of it. It changes how we see the response to doubt. Not as a blanket rejection, but as a very precise mental discipline.
Okay, so to really appreciate this fight, this distinction they were making, we absolutely have to start with the Stoics' foundation, their theory of knowledge, their epistemology. It's what drove everything they did, philosophically speaking.
Absolutely. They were, you could say, obsessed with achieving wisdom, true wisdom, and that whole pursuit was anchored in this really specific idea called kataleptikai fantasia.
Right, kataleptikai fantasia, grasping impressions. Always sounded quite physical, that grasping.
It does, doesn't it? And these are the bedrock. They are mental impressions, so the way the world appears to you, the input you get, but they possess this unique, special quality, a quality that means they perfectly grasp or apprehend how things actually are in reality.
So it's not just seeing something, it's seeing it in a way that guarantees truth.
Precisely. For the Stoic, this specific type of impression, the cataleptic one, is the criterion of truth. It's the benchmark against which all other appearances are measured.
I always understood catalepsis as the intellectual mic drop, like the ultimate proof. It's not enough to just think you see your hand in front of your face. You must see it in such a specific, clear, forceful way that it proves it's a real hand, such that no deceptive impression, like maybe in a dream or a hallucination or even just poor lighting, could ever possibly mimic it exactly. Is that about right?
That's a great way to put it. The uniqueness is key. The Stoics argued it had a certain clarity, distinctness, and force that non-cataleptic impressions lacked.
But here's the million drachma question. How does the Stoic sage know? How do they recognize that this particular impression meets that incredibly rigorous, unique standard? What's the actual mechanism of verification inside the mind?
Yeah, that's where the critics, especially the academics, really pushed them. The Stoics' answer often came down to the idea that the impression itself is, well, self-evident and compelling to the trained mind.
The training matters.
Hugely. Think of it like this. If you have a non-cataleptic impression, maybe seeing a rope in the dark and mistakenly thinking it's a snake.
Classic example.
Classic example, right. That impression probably lacks force. It might be vague, maybe shadowy. A true cataleptic impression, they claimed, forces itself upon the properly prepared mind with a certain undeniable clarity and definition. It's almost like it stamps itself onto the soul.
So it's about recognizing this inherent quality.
Yes, recognizing and responding only to this unique quality. The wise person's training is all about developing the sensitivity to distinguish this gold standard impression from all the fakes and the maybes.
Okay, so the wise person, the Stoic sage, this ideal figure they aim for, only gives assent, only says yes, or Asunkatathesis as they call it, and only gives that assent to these cataleptic, graspable impressions. And this act of assent, this mental yes, is absolutely crucial, isn't it? Because that's the moment where belief is actually formed.
It is the absolute hinge upon which the entire Stoic mental architecture turns. Assent isn't passive, it's an active function of the rational soul. It's a choice, a judgment you make, to affirm or deny the content of an impression.
So the impression just comes in like data.
Like raw data, yeah. But it's the assent, the syncatathesis, that commits you to its truth. And if you assent to a false or unclear impression, well, you've just committed a serious intellectual error. You've formed a false belief.
And this relates directly to the ultimate goal for the Stoic wise person, the acquisition of epistema, true knowledge. Can you walk us through that key definition again? It's very specific.
Right. Epistema for the Stoics isn't just any true belief. It's fundamentally defined as wise belief. And what makes it wise is that it's based on assent given only to cataleptic impressions.
Okay.
And critically, it's characterized by strong assent. This means the assent is firm, unwavering. The key characteristic of epistema is that it is asphalis, which means safe, secure, unshakable, unchangeable by reason or argument.
Wow, unchangeable by reason. That sounds strong.
It is. Once the wise person correctly identifies a cataleptic impression and gives their strong assent, that commitment, that belief is absolute and stable. It cannot be dislodged by clever counterarguments or tricky dialectic. It's knowledge built on solid rock, not shifting sand.
Okay, so knowledge is this unshakable structure built on grasping impressions and strong assent. And this provides the crucial contrast with what they desperately wanted to avoid at all costs, doxa, or opinion.
Exactly. Doxa.
We often think of opinion today as just, a casual preference like, my opinion is that blue is better than green. But for the Stoic, it was a philosophical disaster, wasn't it? A sign of foolishness.
Absolutely a disaster. Opinion, doxa, is fundamentally unwise belief. It's what happens when you give assent incorrectly. It results either from giving weak assent to a cataleptic impression not fully committing, or more commonly, from giving assent, weak or strong, to a non-cataleptic impression.
So basically guessing or jumping to conclusions.
Pretty much. If the impression is unclear or indistinct or just plain false, and you assent anyway, maybe out of haste or desire or fear, you are opining, and in doing so, you are committing a fundamental human error, the root of all sorts of bad judgments and emotional disturbances.
It wasn't just an intellectual mistake then, it had real-world consequences for living well.
Definitely. Chrysippus, who was really their system builder, their intellectual powerhouse, dedicated serious energy to this. We know from lists of his works that he wrote treatises like Proofs that the Sage Does Not Opine.
He literally wrote the book on it.
He literally did. This wasn't some minor academic housekeeping detail for them. Avoiding opinion was absolutely essential to avoiding error, bad choices, and ultimately moral folly. It was central to living a rational, virtuous life.
Okay, that really does make the stakes incredibly high for every single impression that comes along.
Right.
So let's make it practical. If an impression comes into the sage's mind and they examine it and they recognize it does not meet that super high standard of catalepsis, what is the immediate moment-to-moment directive? What must they do?
The directive is clear and non-negotiable. They must practice Asunkatathesis. They must Asunkatathetin. They must withhold assent.
Withhold assent. Just stop the process before belief forms.
Exactly. Refuse the impression's claim to truth. This refusal isn't passive indifference. It's an active, mandatory defensive practice. It is precisely how the Stoic sage avoids the fatal error of opining, thus keeping their mind, their rational core, safe from the weak foundations of mere belief or falsehood.
Okay, so if I'm the listener, what I really need to lock onto here is the scope of this Asunkatathesis. It's absolutely not a general attitude of doubt about everything.
Not at all. That's the crucial point we're building towards.
It is a hyper-specific, demanding, impression by impression, local choice. It's like an active mental filter being applied constantly.
That's the perfect description. A local surgical filter. It is the moment-to-moment management of the mind's inputs, ensuring you only build your intellectual house, your system of beliefs, on solid, reliable, cataleptic ground.
Constant vigilance, as Mad-Eye Moody would say.
He'd make a decent Stoic, perhaps. But yes, this constant vigilance, this highly localized discipline of withholding assent when necessary is what defines Stoic intellectual integrity. And it's precisely this practice, this Asunkatathesis, where the academics launched the most devastating attack.
Okay, here's where the philosophical tectonic plates really start to shift. The academic skeptics, emerging from Plato's Academy, but taking it in a much more skeptical direction, particularly under Arcesilos, they looked at this whole intricate Stoic system. And they didn't necessarily reject the idea of catalepsis as a theoretical criterion for truth. They didn't say a grasping impression is a dumb idea. What they said was much more damaging.
Much more damaging, yes. They essentially said, great standard, Stoics, really high bar. Problem is, absolutely nothing in the real world actually meets that standard.
Ouch. So the standard is fine in theory, just useless in practice.
Exactly. Their primary weapon here was what's often called the indistinguishability argument. It's quite clever, really.
How did that work? Lay it out for us.
Well, they argued that for any allegedly cataleptic impression, you might have, let's say, the perfectly clear, true impression of your friend standing before you.
Okay, the gold standard impression.
Right. The academics argued that there always exists, at least in principle, the possibility of an indistinguishable non-cataleptic impression, a false one that feels exactly the same.
Like what kind of false one?
Could be anything. A vivid dream image of your friend. A hallucination caused by fever. Maybe even, they speculated, an illusion created by a mischievous god or demon. Or simply identical twins. The point is, if there's even a possibility of a false impression that is subjectively identical to the supposedly true one,
then you can't be absolutely sure which one you're having right now.
Precisely. If you, the subject, cannot reliably tell the difference between the true cataleptic impression and the potentially false non-cataleptic lookalike, then neither of them actually meets the Stoics' own strict standard of being unique, self-validating, and guaranteeing truth. The possibility of error hasn't been ruled out.
Wow, okay. That is a really powerful internal critique. They're using the Stoics' own definition of knowledge against them.
Exactly. It's an internal attack. And if the academics managed to convince themselves and tried to convince others that no impression could ever truly satisfy the Stoics' hyper-rigorous standard for catalepsis,
then they drew a seemingly logical conclusion, not just for themselves, but for the Stoics themselves.
yes. They basically said, okay, Stoics, you're rational people, right? You believe in following logic. Well, if no impression is truly cataleptic, then according to your own rules about only assenting to cataleptic impressions,
You should never assent to anything.
exactly. You should, by your own standards, Epochē. You should universally suspend judgment about everything.
And Epochē is the Greek word for this universal suspension of judgment.
That's the one. Epochē becomes the academic skeptics' defining term, their flagship concept. They essentially weaponize the Stoics' own rules about assent and catalepsis to argue that the consistent Stoic sage must necessarily live a fully skeptical life, a life without beliefs.
Because belief requires assent.
And assent, the academics argued, can never be truly warranted according to the Stoics' own impossible standards. So the only rational path left is Epochē.
Okay, now this leads us directly smack bang into the core problem we're investigating today, the scholarly conflation. Because it seems many ancient sources, looking back at this debate, and subsequently many modern readers and even scholars, started treating Epochē, the academic suspension, and the Stoics' Asunkatathesis, their withholding of assent, as if they were functional synonyms, as if they were basically the same thing.
Yes. The reasoning seems to go, well, if you withhold assent from an impression, isn't that just suspending judgment about it? And if the academics argue you should do that for all impressions, then withholding assent is suspending judgment. What's the big difference?
It sounds plausible on the surface.
It does. But this conflation, as we're arguing today, is very likely a misunderstanding, possibly even a rhetorical trap originally said by the academics themselves, or at least perpetuated by later philosophers who weren't tracking the original nuances.
So we need to be really critical of the evidence that seems to equate these two terms.
Extremely critical. We have to look at who is speaking, when they're speaking, and why they're equating them.
Okay, let's dig into one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence for this equation. It comes from the later Pyrrhonian skeptic, Sextus Empiricus. He's writing centuries after Chrysippus and the early Stoics. What does Sextus tell us?
Right, Sextus is a crucial source, but also a tricky one. He often preserves arguments from the academic tradition. In one passage, he's reporting a standard skeptical argument designed specifically to push the Stoic into the skeptical corner, to show that Stoicism collapses into skepticism.
So it's a polemical context from the start.
Absolutely. And notice how the argument begins. It starts with a premise that the Stoic explicitly rejects, namely the premise that everything is non-cataleptic or that grasping impressions don't exist.
Okay, so it assumes the academic victory from the outset.
Exactly. From that external skeptical premise, the argument proceeds something like this. Premise 1, nothing is cataleptic, academic view. Premise 2, the wise person never opines, Stoic view. Premise 3, assenting to the non-cataleptic is opinion, Stoic view. Conclusion 1. Therefore, the wise person must withhold assent, Asunkatathesis, about everything.
Okay, that follows logically if you accept premise 1.
Right. But then comes the critical, potentially misleading line where the equation happens. Sextus, reporting the argument, says something like, and withholding assent, Asunkatathesis, is nothing other than suspending judgment, Epochē. Therefore, the sage will suspend judgment, Epochē, about everything.
Ah, there it is. The
Let's
direct equation. It sounds pretty definitive when you just pull that line out.
It does, but the context is absolutely everything here. The skeptic reporting this argument is not carefully documenting internal Stoic terminology or practice. The skeptic is forcing the Stoic concept of Asunkatathesis into the skeptical framework of Epochē by starting from a premise the Stoic fundamentally denies.
So it's less a description of what Stoics did think and more a description of what skeptics thought Stoics should think, given the skeptical assumption that knowledge is impossible.
Precisely. If you accept the starting line that no cataleptic impressions exist, then yes, practicing Asunkatathesis rigorously would automatically result in global Epochē. You'd withhold assent from everything because nothing meets the standard. But the whole point is the Stoic never accepted that starting line.
They fiercely defended the existence of the criterion of truth, the cataleptic fantasia.
Fiercely, that was the bedrock. So for the Stoic, Asunkatathesis was a local, temporary defensive maneuver used only when faced with a specific non-cataleptic impression. For the academic, who believed all impressions were non-cataleptic, the logical consequence was Epochē, a universal, permanent commitment to doubt. Two very different states of mind, stemming from opposite starting points.
Okay, that makes sense of the Sextus passage. But what about other later sources? You mentioned writers like Alexander of Aphrodisias, who was an Aristotelian commentator, or Clement of Alexandria, an early Christian writer. Sometimes they seem to use Stoic terms like assent alongside the academic term Epochē.
Yes, and we need to be equally wary there, maybe even more so. These writers are operating much later, typically in the 2nd and 3rd century CE. This was a period of significant philosophical eclecticism and syncretism.
Meaning ideas were getting mixed and matched more freely.
Exactly. Schools were borrowing from each other, arguing against each other using shared, sometimes simplified terminology. Alexander, for instance, was often arguing against the Stoics. Clement was trying to integrate useful philosophical concepts into a Christian framework.
So they might not have been interested in preserving the fine-grained distinctions of the original 3rd century BCE debate between Chrysippus and Arcesilaus.
It's highly unlikely that was their primary goal. It's far more probable that their generalized use of Epochē simply reflects the common philosophical vocabulary for doubt or suspension current in their time, divorced from the precise, rigorously defined, and polemically charged terminology of the original Stoic academic clash.
So using these later texts to say, see, Stoics used Epochē too, is potentially anachronistic. It's reading later usage back onto the earlier figures.
That's a very real danger. If the original Stoics, like Chrysippus, had a specific philosophical reason to resist equating their Asunkatathesis with the academic's Epochē, then these later texts aren't reliable guides to the original Stoic position. They might actually be misrepresenting the core Stoic intellectual project by blurring that crucial line.
Which means we really need to find positive evidence, ideally from the Stoics themselves or sources reporting them closely, showing that they did see a difference and did resist that equation. We need to find that explicit resistance.
And thankfully we do. It's fragmentary, as so much early Stoic material is, but we have some really suggestive passages, particularly attributed to Chrysippus himself, that point strongly in this direction. Okay, so where do we find this positive evidence? Probably the single best surviving piece that shows Chrysippus actively distinguishing his school's practice from the academic concept of Epochē comes via Plutarch.
Plutarch, right. Not a Stoic himself, often critical, but he preserves a lot of material.
Exactly. He's discussing the Stoic approach to dialectic, logical argument, and debate, and he quotes Chrysippus on the purpose of engaging in certain kinds of arguments.
And what's so fascinating about this quote, as you hinted before, is that Chrysippus doesn't just ignore the term epochē. He actually uses it, but uses it specifically to label the opposition.
That's the key move. Plutarch quotes Chrysippus advising against a certain style of dialectical engagement. Specifically, he warns against engaging in arguments primarily just to achieve intellectual victory, or to comprehensively refute an opponent on every single point, a sort of argumentative overkill.
Okay, so a warning against arguing just to win or tear down.
Yes. And Chrysippus says, according to Plutarch, that this particular combative style belongs to those who observe suspension of judgment, Epochē, about all matters, and it supports what they want.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack that. He's saying Epochē is not just a state, but something people observe, like a practice or a doctrine.
Yes, it's presented as the defining feature of a specific group.
And that practice belongs to them, the academics. It's their thing. And it supports their goal, their agenda.
Precisely. He frames Epochē not as a neutral description of withholding belief, but as the functional, rhetorical tool of the academics, designed explicitly to support their philosophical goal, which the Stoics saw as ultimately negative or destructive.
That is a phenomenal piece of evidence. It's like saying that way of arguing, oh, that's for the Epicurity, but that serves their purpose, not ours. So what was the Stoic purpose in argumentation, according to Chrysippus in this context, in contrast?
The Stoic purpose, Chrysippus insists, was explicitly constructive. It was to achieve episteme, knowledge, particularly knowledge of nature, by which we can live virtuously, living in agreement with nature. That's the Stoic telos, the ultimate goal.
So knowledge for the sake of living well.
Exactly. And their use of dialectic was supposed to serve that goal. Chrysippus says they intended primarily to teach their initiates the basics, the core truths of Stoic philosophy. They would only bring opposing arguments, like skeptical ones, into view when absolutely necessary, specifically to destroy the plausibility of those false ideas in the student's mind. It was targeted inoculation, not wholesale warfare. The academics, by contrast, seem to pursue dialectics primarily in order to generate contradictions and thereby achieve the state of global epochē.
So Chrysippus is drawing a line in the sand here. He's saying Epochē, the universal suspension of judgment, is a distinct academic foil. It's the very opposite of the entire Stoic mission, which was all about securing reliable knowledge to guide life.
That's precisely the implication. He sees epochē as something fundamentally different in its scope, its intention, and its ultimate goal, compared to the Stoics' careful local act of withholding assent, Asunkatathesis, only when an impression fails the test.
Okay, this shows Chrysippus saw epochē as the other team's strategy. But where did that conceptual difference really originate? It seems closely tied to Arcelius, the figure who really revived skepticism within Plato's Academy around the same time the early Stoics were getting started.
It is very closely tied to him. Our source here is Diogenes Laertius, the ancient biographer of philosophers. He tells us something really specific about Arcesilas. He says Arcesilas was the first to hold back affirmations, apotheses, on account of the oppositions of arguments.
Okay, wait, let's pause on that terminology again because this seems crucial. The Stoic practice we discussed, Asunkatathesis, is about withholding assent, synchatathesis, to a specific incoming sensory or mental impression, fantasia.
Right, triggered by the quality of the impression itself.
But Diogenes says Arcesilas is holding back affirmations, apotheses, and he's doing it on account of the oppositions of arguments. What does this change in terminology and justification signify? It feels like a different level of operation.
It signifies a major shift, I think, from a primarily perception-based response to a primarily dialectic-based stance. It's a shift from the local to the global. The Stoic, ideally, responds directly to the perceived quality of the individual impression hitting their senses or mind right now. Is this clear and distinct? Does it grasp reality? That's the question. Asunkatathesis is the answer if it's no.
Okay.
Arcesilas, according to this account, isn't primarily responding to individual impressions. He's responding to the perceived overall failure of human reason across the board. He looked at the history of philosophy, at all the brilliant people arguing back and forth.
The oppositions of arguments.
Exactly. Thesis, antithesis, endless debate, no resolution in sight on major issues. He observed this endless, apparently irresolvable conflict, and from that observation, he drew his conclusion.
Which was?
Since reason itself seems to lead to these perpetual contradictions, since no one could apparently affirm anything conclusively without generating an equally plausible counterargument, he concluded that the only rational course was to globally suspend all affirmation, apophysis. He pursued epochē as a universal goal, a general policy derived from this meta-level reflection on argument itself.
Okay, so the academic suspension, Epochē, is driven by this big-picture reflection on the history of philosophy, on the collective inability of human reason to reach agreement.
Yes, a conclusion drawn from dialectic, from the clash of arguments.
Whereas the Stoic withholding of assent, Asunkatathesis, is driven by the immediate perceived quality of the sensory or mental data in the present moment.
Exactly right. Triggered by epistemology, by the nature of perception itself. And this fundamental difference in justification and scope allowed the Stoic, particularly Chrysippus, to level a very serious charge back at the academic skeptic.
What was the charge?
Well, think about it. If Arcesilaus and his followers sought epochē as a universal goal, as the rational way to live, how did they justify this universal suspension? They justified it, primarily, by arguing against the Stoic criterion of truth. They put forward arguments to demonstrate that the cataleptic fantasia doesn't exist or can't be reliably identified.
Right, the indistinguishability argument we talked about.
Exactly. But in doing so, in putting forward that argument, weren't they implicitly affirming something? Weren't they committed to the truth of the claim, no impression is cataleptic?
Ah, I see. To justify universal doubt, they had to be certain about the reason for that doubt. They had to positively believe that knowledge was impossible.
That's how the Stoics saw it. From the Stoic perspective, the academic wasn't truly suspending judgment on everything. They were suspending judgment on all specific claims based on their prior unshakable commitment to a global negative belief. The belief that nothing is knowable, or at least that nothing is cataleptic.
And that, to a Stoic who defined knowledge as firm, unshakable assent, looked suspiciously like dogmatism.
Precisely. Negative dogmatism, but dogmatism nonetheless. Chrysippus seems to have interpreted the academics not as genuinely open-minded, non-dogmatic inquirers just living questioningly, but as dogmatists in denial.
They were dogmatically certain about uncertainty.
Something like that. Committed to affirming the global belief that nothing is knowable or graspable in the Stoic sense, specifically in order to justify their practice of universal epochē. This polemical interpretation gave Chrysippus every possible reason to reject the term epochē completely, even when describing the sage's temporary moments of intellectual stillness.
Because using the term epochē would be conceding ground to the enemy, or worse, adopting the language of someone who, from the Stoic viewpoint, was actually a closet dogmatist.
Exactly. It was the term favored by the opposition, an opposition who, by their very justification for using it, exposed themselves, in Stoic eyes, as secretly holding a firm, albeit negative, dogmatic position about the limits of knowledge. Why would Chrysippus use their flagship term to describe his own sage's careful local practice? It wouldn't make any sense.
Okay, this is building a really strong case. If the early Stoics, especially Chrysippus, needed a term to describe the mental state achieved when the wise person successfully performs the Asunkatathesis, that crucial act of withholding assent to a non-grasping impression, but they adamantly refused to use the academic term Epochē because of all these polemical and philosophical reasons.
Right.
Then what word did they use? Did they just not have a term for that state?
Well, the evidence, again, fragmentary but consistent, points towards a different, quite beautiful and specific Greek word, Hēsuchazein.
Hēsuchazein. How do you translate that roughly?
It means most literally to be still, to be quiet, or to be silent. Hēsuchia is stillness or quietness.
Okay, stillness, quietness. That feels different from suspension.
It does, and it's the term that seems to truly capture the Stoic psychological intent when dealing with uncertainty or potential falsehood. Interestingly, most of the direct evidence linking Chrysippus to this term comes from his instructions on how to navigate logical puzzles or sophisms.
Sophisms, right. Those tricky, deliberately misleading arguments designed to trip you up and force you into accepting something absurd. Like Zeno's paradoxes, maybe?
Exactly like those, or simpler ones used in dialectical training. Let's take the classic example that Chrysippus definitely discussed. The sorites argument, also known as the heap argument.
Yes, the heap. Always a mind bender. Remind us how it works.
It works by exploiting vagueness through gradual change. You start with something that clearly isn't a heap, say 1 grain of sand. 1 grain is not a heap, right?
Agreed. Not a heap.
Okay. Now, add 1 more grain. Are 2 grains of sand a heap?
No, definitely not.
3 grains. 4. The argument proceeds little by little, katamikron in Greek. At each step, adding just 1 grain seems intuitively not to make the crucial difference between not heap and heap.
Right. It feels like there's no single grain that suddenly tips it over.
Exactly. But if you keep assenting at each step, no, still not a heap, no, still not a heap, you are logically forced towards the absurd conclusion that even 10,000 grains of sand, or 1,000,000 grains collectively, do not constitute a heap because you never cross the line.
Which is obviously wrong. 1,000,000 grains of sand is definitely a heap. So how does the Stoic sage escape this logical trap? They can't just deny basic logic.
No, they can't deny logic, but they can refuse to play the game by its flawed rules. The sage must recognize the trick and refuse to go along with the faulty logic inherent in the gradual stepping. How? Chrysippus advised the sage, when faced with such an argument, to Hēsuchazein.
To be silent or stand still?
Yes. Specifically, to do this just before the argument reaches the point of clear absurdity, or maybe even earlier, as soon as the dangerous vagueness is recognized. Cicero, reporting on this, explicitly says that Chrysippus thought one should be silent, that is what they call Hēsuchazein, when faced with these kinds of gradual questions like when does something become many or few or large or small?
Okay, now this is absolutely crucial. When Chrysippus advises the sage to Hēsuchazein, to be silent or stand still, is this merely a verbal refusal to answer the annoying person asking the sophistical question, like just shrugging your shoulders and saying, I'm not playing? Or is it describing a deeper internal mental action? Because if it's just, telling the sophist to buzz off, it doesn't seem that philosophically profound.
That's the million drachma question again, isn't it? And the answer, based on the Stoic system, has to be that it's profoundly philosophical, deeply internal. The outward verbal silence, the refusal to answer, is merely the manifestation or the result of the critical internal act.
Which is?
The internal act is Asunkatathesis. It's the refusal to assent to the dangerous premise being offered at each step. In the Stoics, the dangerous premise is the impression that adding this 1 more grain does not change the classification from not heap to heap.
Ah, okay. The sage recognizes that premise, while seemingly innocent, is the one leading down the garden path to absurdity.
Precisely. So the sage withholds assent from that specific impression. They refuse to endorse its truth. And by refusing to assent, by performing Asunkatathesis, the sage actively avoids forming the belief that would commit them to the next step in the faulty logic. They stop the chain reaction internally.
So Hēsuchazein, the stillness or silence, isn't just saying nothing, it's doing nothing internally. It describes the state of the soul when assent is blocked.
That seems to be exactly it. Hēsuchazein describes that complete lack of intellectual motion, the stopping of the belief formation process when faced with a problematic input. It's the mental state that results from successful Asunkatathesis.
Okay, that makes much more sense. And we see this principle reinforced elsewhere, right? Like in their instructions for handling other fallacies, such as equivocation.
Yes, absolutely. The fallacy of equivocation, or homonymy as they sometimes called it, happens when a word with multiple meanings is used in a way that shifts the meaning mid-argument, leading to an absurd conclusion.
Can you give an example they might have used?
Well, Sextus gives examples like playing on the word dog, animal versus star constellation. A simpler one might involve confusing, say, a garment that is physically manly, maybe large, or designed for a man with a garment that possesses the ethical virtue of being courageous or manly in spirit.
Right, confusing size or style with a moral quality.
Exactly. If a sophist constructs an argument that slides between these two meanings, they might try to force you to conclude something utterly absurd like, this particular tunic possesses the virtue of courage.
Which is nonsense. A piece of cloth can't be courageous.
Of course not. So how does the trained Stoic dialectician avoid getting trapped into assenting to this absurd belief? Again, the sources suggest the directive is to Hēsuchazein, to recognize the equivocation and refuse to proceed down that faulty path.
By withholding assent from the premise that relies on the ambiguous word.
Yes, it's the same mechanism. The stillness, Hēsuchazein, is the result of the internal refusal, Asunkatathesis, to accept the flawed impression generated by the equivocal language. In both the Sorites and the equivocation fallacy, Hēsuchazein functions as the sage's mental defense mechanism against being drawn into error. It's the soul's refusal to assent to the impression that demands the next logically flawed step towards absurdity.
And it's so revealing, isn't it, that later writers, particularly someone like Cicero, who's much closer to the academic skeptical tradition, when he discusses these very same sophisms, like the Sorites, he often seems to replace Chrysippus' specific technical term, Hēsuchazein, with the more general academic term, Epochē, suspending judgment.
Yes. That substitution is a really powerful data point, I think. It strongly reinforces the idea that the original specificity of the Stoic term Hēsuchazein was either lost over time or perhaps even intentionally submerged by those who favored the academic perspective or terminology. They just swapped in their own preferred word for holding back.
Which obscured the uniquely Stoic flavor of the action.
Exactly. And Chrysippus likely favored Hēsuchazein precisely because its meaning, its resonance, extended far beyond just logical sparring matches. It wasn't just about keeping quiet when a sophist tried to trick you.
How do we know that?
Because Plutarch, again, gives us another precious fragment. He confirms this broader application. He reports that Chrysippus advised people, generally not just dialecticians, to ton Hēsuchazein aim, which means to keep the stillness or keep quiet about matters where they lacked sufficient experience or empirical grounding.
So outside of formal logic, in everyday life or science.
Yes. The example Plutarch gives is avoiding making mistaken guesses about things like, say, the internal workings of the human body if you're not a doctor. He contrasts this with Plato, who he thinks made unfounded guesses about physiology.
So if you don't have the data, if you haven't done the inquiry, the Stoic advice is Hēsuchazein, keep still, keep quiet internally. Don't form a belief.
Precisely. This is clearly about avoiding holding mistaken beliefs, forming opinions, doxa, based on insufficient evidence, not just about literally keeping your mouth shut. It's about achieving internal stillness when certainty isn't available.
Okay, let's nail down the core philosophical rationale one more time then. Why is withholding assent, Asunkatathesis, so perfectly captured by the image of standing still or being quiet? Hēsuchazein. This seems like the most elegant connection in the entire deep dive.
It connects directly and beautifully to the core of Stoic psychology, specifically their theory of action and emotion. They had a fundamental doctrine that every doing, every feeling, every impulse to act, every motion in the soul, what they collectively termed hormē, absolutely requires prior assent.
Assent is the trigger.
Assent is the necessary condition, the intellectual trigger for any psychic movement, whether that's reaching for an object, feeling fear, or embarking on a course of action. The impression presents a possible action or feeling as appropriate. Assent is the yes that sets the soul in motion towards it.
Okay, so if assent is required for motion.
Then what happens if you deliberately withhold assent? If you perform Asunkatathesis when faced with an impression proposing some action or belief?
There's no trigger, no motion.
Exactly. That impression, because assent is withheld, literally produces no motion, akinesia, in the soul. The impulse, hormē, is stopped dead in its tracks before it even begins.
I see it now. If the assent mechanism is deliberately frozen or blocked for that impression, the entire psychic machinery related to it grinds to a halt. It's paralyzed for that potential action or belief.
Precisely. The person who successfully practices Asunkatathesis in the face of a misleading or uncertain impression is, quite literally, intellectually and impulsively still and quiet with respect to that impression. They are unmoved. Hēsuchazein is therefore the perfect, vivid, almost physical description of the state of the soul achieved by Asunkatathesis.
It's a temporary surgical freeze on judgment and impulse regarding that specific thing, preserving the overall integrity and rationality of the mind until a truly cataleptic impression arrives that warrants assent and motion.
Yes. It is inherently local, responsive, and temporary vigilance.
Whereas Epochē, as defined and practiced by the academics, sounds increasingly like the global permanent factory shutdown, a decision to cease all production, justified by the prior belief that the entire system is inherently faulty and incapable of producing reliable goods.
That's a fantastic analogy. One is a targeted quality control stop on the assembly line, Hēsuchazein resulting from Asunkatathesis. The other is closing the whole factory down, Epochē.
Okay, so when we bring all these threads together, the Stoic focus on catalepsis, their practice of Asunkatathesis, their likely use of Hēsuchazein to describe the resulting state, and their explicit rejection of the academic Epochē, it really reveals the profound stakes and the nature of the disagreement.
Yeah, it really wasn't just a minor semantic squabble over synonyms. The choice of words reflected fundamentally different philosophical projects. Absolutely. The Stoic was committed to Asunkatathesis, characterized internally by the temporary stillness of Hēsuchazein, all in the service of eventually achieving episteme. The academic was committed to Epochē, a global, potentially permanent suspension, justified by the perceived impossibility of catalepsis. They were never really discussing the same mental state or the same goal.
Which makes it almost certain, as you said at the start, that they were arguing past each other a lot of the time. It explains so much of the frustration you sense in the surviving texts.
It really does.
Yeah.
Think about how each side likely perceived the other through the lens of their own terminology and goals. The academics looked at the Stoic demand for rigorously withholding assent, Asunkatathesis, on every single uncertain impression.
Yeah.
And because the academics already believed that all impressions were ultimately uncertain, non-cataleptic, they interpreted the Stoic practice as logically leading to, and therefore being equivalent to, universal epochē.
So from the academic viewpoint, the Stoics were just inconsistent skeptics in denial, perhaps.
Exactly. They thought the Stoics' own rules, if followed consistently, must commit them to universal doubt. Epochē, even if the Stoics themselves refused to admit it.
Okay, that's the academic view of the Stoics. How did the Stoics see the academics in return?
Well, the Stoics, particularly Chrysippus, looked back at the academics and their championing of Epochē. They asked why. Why adopt this radical, life-altering stance of universal suspension?
And the answer was?
The answer seemed to be because the academics held the firm, universal, dogmatic belief that nothing is cataleptic, that the Stoic criterion for knowledge is unattainable.
The negative dogmatism point again.
Yes. So Chrysippus interpreted the academic practice of Epochē not as genuine open-mindedness, but as a consequence of a prior, unshakable dogmatic commitment to a negative thesis about knowledge. Thus, from the Stoic viewpoint, the academics were dogmatists in denial.
Wow. Each side saw the other as being in denial about their true position. The academics saw Stoics as closet skeptics, and Stoics saw academics as closet dogmatists.
It seems very likely. And the linguistic confusion, the conflation of Asunkatathesis with Epochē, just fueled this mutual misunderstanding and philosophical animosity on both sides for centuries.
This reframing completely moves the debate far beyond the simple, almost cartoonish question of, does knowledge exist, yes or no?
Far beyond.
The real substantive disagreement, the real stakes, are actually about intellectual methodology, about character almost. How do you, as a thinking person, responsibly handle uncertainty while still maintaining respect for truth and the possibility of finding it?
That's the crux of it. It becomes a question of intellectual virtue and strategy. And they offer two profoundly different paths.
Path 1, the Stoic way, defined by Asunkatathesis leading to Hēsuchazein. Describe that path again.
The Stoic way is fundamentally a local response. It's reactive, specific, and optimistic in a way. When a particular impression arrives that is unclear, indistinct, or potentially false, you tackle that specific uncertainty right then and there by withholding assent, Asunkatathesis, achieving a momentary stillness, Hēsuchazein, regarding that one issue.
But crucially,
this local action always preserves the possibility of warranted affirmation later. It keeps the door open for knowledge. The hope is that eventually a truly cataleptic fantasia will arise regarding this or other matters, and when it does, the sage will recognize it and give firm assent, achieving episteme. Their hope is local, immediate, and tied to the quality of individual perceptions.
okay, that's the Stoic path. Local vigilance, preserving hope. Now, path 2, the academic way, defined by Epochē.
The academic way is fundamentally a global response. Their skepticism isn't primarily triggered by the quality of this or that specific impression. It's driven by a higher-level reflection on the collective failure of human reasoning as evidenced by history and dialectic.
The oppositions of arguments again, the fact that experts always disagree, that philosophy seems to go in circles.
Precisely. They look at the big picture, the systemic inability of human reason, as they perceive it, to arrive at consensus or certainty on important matters. And from that global assessment, they conclude that the only rational response is a general, universal suspension of affirmation, Epochē, across the board. Their doubt is systemic, derived from a general lesson about human fallibility.
So the Stoic sage remains intellectually active, constantly scanning impressions, waiting like a sentry for the one solid rock of catalepsis to build upon, engaging in Hēsuchazein only as a temporary defense when the sand beneath their feet is explicitly shifting on a specific point.
Yes, actively filtering, actively waiting.
While the academic sage, based on their assessment of the whole landscape, steps back entirely from the project of building affirmative beliefs. declaring the entire intellectual terrain too fundamentally unstable for any reliable construction. They adopt Epochē as a standing policy.
That's a very good way to capture the difference in posture. One is vigilant waiting, the other is principled withdrawal.
So for you, the listener, trying to make sense of this ancient feud, this recontextualization is absolutely critical. The Stoic academic debate wasn't just a dry argument about whether we can know things. It was much deeper. It was a profound disagreement about how we should intellectually and ethically react to our own undeniable moments of uncertainty and ignorance.
Yes.
Should we respond locally, dealing with uncertainty, impression by impression, always preserving the hope for individual, certain knowledge when the evidence finally warrants it? That's the Stoic path of Asunkatathesis, Hēsuchazein.
Sure.
Or should we respond globally, drawing a general lesson from the pervasive disagreements and apparent limitations of reason, and adopt universal doubt, Epochē, as our fundamental guiding principle? That's the academic path. It is a profound choice in intellectual strategy, maybe even in life strategy. #outro.
Well, this deep dive has really shown the immense power hiding in just a few often overlooked Greek words. It demonstrates how getting the linguistic precision right can literally define the identity, the core project, of an entire school of thought. Absolutely. We moved from what often looks like a confusing scholarly conflation, treating Asunkatathesis and Epochē as basically the same, to uncovering what appears to be a deliberate, philosophically motivated boundary actively maintained by the early Stoics, especially Chrysippus, to separate their practice from that of their greatest rivals.
And understanding that boundary changes everything. The Stoic refusal to adopt the term Epochē wasn't just, philosophical tribalism or stubbornness, was it?
No, it seems to have been a philosophical necessity for them. Asunkatathesis is the momentary, surgical discipline required to avoid error on a case-by-case basis. Hēsuchazein is the resulting stillness and quietude of the soul when that discipline is exercised. But Epochē, for them, represented something entirely different. A systematic, global, potentially permanent commitment to doubt, likely grounded, in their view, on a negative, dogmatic belief.
So by later writers substituting the general term Epochē for the specific Hēsuchazein when describing Stoic practice,
they inadvertently, or perhaps sometimes intentionally, obscured the Stoics' true intention and the unique character of their response to uncertainty. The Stoics were not aiming for a universal retreat from belief into suspension. They were aiming for momentary, targeted vigilance leading to eventual, well-founded certainty.
Okay, so let's bring this home for the listener. When you, in your own life, encounter a moment of profound uncertainty, maybe it's in trying to understand a complex news story with conflicting accounts, or facing a difficult personal or business decision where the right path isn't clear, or even just grappling with a moment of existential doubt.
We all face these moments.
Remember the fundamental choice in strategy that seems to have defined these two major ancient schools.
Ask yourself, which path do you naturally tend towards, or which path seems more rational or helpful in that situation? Do you instinctively seek the momentary stillness of Hēsuchazein? Do you try to tackle the ambiguity locally, one piece of conflicting evidence, one uncertain feeling at a time, always holding out hope, searching for that single solid impression or piece of data that can be truly affirmed, allowing you to move forward on that specific point?
That's the Stoic-inspired approach.
Or do you find yourself more inclined to adopt the posture of Epochē? Do you step back and suspend judgment on the whole issue? Perhaps because the sheer weight of conflicting arguments, the general lack of consensus, or the history of error convinces you that finding certainty on this kind of matter is maybe just impossible or too risky right now.
That's the academic-inspired approach.
It's a fundamental choice we all make, consciously or not, when faced with the unknown. Is your response surgical, local vigilance aimed at eventual certainty? Or is it systemic, global retreat driven by the recognition of pervasive uncertainty? Which approach, in the end, do you find most conducive to your own sense of intellectual integrity and navigating a complex world? Something to reflect on.
A fantastic place to leave it. Thank you for that deep dive.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating distinction.